Hello, Bridget Croke.
Hello, Dave Ford.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Environmental Intelligence Podcast. I'm Dave Ford, founder of the OPLN and SALT, and I'm here with Bridget Croke, Managing Director of Closed Loop Partners.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Really happy to be here. And with the Environmental Intelligence Podcast and really just our thesis in general, it's really built on the idea of how we can really get everybody significantly smarter about the biggest environmental challenges that are plaguing this earth. And Bridget is an expert on circular economy, knows more about plastics than most human beings on this planet. And I think what we want to do today is really deep dive and really sort of pick your brain about, what you feel like, leaders and really the entire industry needs to understand about the circular economy to help accelerate progress. So sort of an open question, but maybe to start off, what are you working on? What's sort of some of the top projects right now that are the Closed Loop's diving into?
Yeah, maybe I'll back up even behind, just to your kind of bigger meta question first before I dig into some of our stuff. And Closed Loop Partners is an investment and innovation firm working to accelerate a more circular economy. So that's kind of our whole premise of the work that we're doing. And I guess I would just back up and say that from the perspective of what it is, what are the trends, the idea is that we have packaging and product supply chains that are today primarily leveraging some sort of extractive process to use raw materials out of nature, utilize those materials, sometimes kind of one time, sometimes multiple times, and then that what was valuable, kind of costly material ends up in a landfill and an incinerator or kind of other outcomes where we're no longer using the value of that material anymore. And so that's something that we think is very inefficient from an economic standpoint. So the reality is that if we could use that material at its end of life as the feedstock for future products and packaging, you could save billions of dollars from ending up in a hole in the ground, essentially, or being burned off, and be able to kind of reduce the amount of raw materials that are needed, which is problematic from an environmental and often a human health standpoint. So really, it's no less than kind of transitioning our material supply chains entirely and to scale up the ability to utilize these materials so we don't have to extract as many non-renewable raw materials. So that's kind of the backdrop.
So in the case of plastics, you have fossil fuels, natural gas mostly, and oil being used to being pulled out of the earth is cracked into plastic. I think a lot of people don't even realize that, which is quite insane.
And frankly, it's the fastest part of that industry's growth. So if we look at all the renewable energy that's being created, which is super exciting, and kind of that shifting another major part of the economy to be more sustainable, that whole industry, its fastest growth area is plastics. So if we can shift where they're getting those inputs, that's a massive economic opportunity, environmental opportunity, and we think human health opportunity as well.
So that dovetails into what happens we're talking about waste. We're talking about plastic waste. We can also talk about aluminum and a bunch of other materials at the end of life.
Yeah, and frankly, plastic is not only, your water bottle that you use or your butter tub, it's also your clothing for many people. So it's the car that you're in, it's your car seat. There's so many use cases for that. But yes, this is also true of metals. It's true of fiber, which comes from trees. And I remember having, because we talk about plastic so much, someone asked me recently, she was like, remember back in the day when we used to be worried about trees? Are we still worried about that? And so there are trades-offs to different materials. So this is relevant across material types.
Did you tell your friend, yes, we are still worried about that?
Yes, we still care about that. And maybe the media doesn't, not enough, but yes, we still care.
The media's got a lot to cover when it comes to the environment these days. I mean, especially when significant swaths of the earth are on fire at any given time and storms blowing through. And plastic, plastic waste in the ocean's gotten a tremendous amount of press in the last 5 years. I wouldn't say it's getting as much press these days as maybe it should.
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and a debatable question, I guess, from a philosophical standpoint. I've seen more impact and dollars put into solving these issues in the last maybe 4 years than I've seen in my 20 plus years working in this field, because of that drumbeat that happened. And there's kind of a whole interesting case study to be done on like the anatomy of a movement and the impact that's been made. Long way to go. But also certainly to your point on the, what needs to be covered, a lot of climate issues that are very relevant, and so glad to see that that's getting steam too. And I would note that one of the things that I'd really like to see is that the connection be made between the goals of the circular economy and the goals around solutions around climate, because the reason we're trying to build a circular economy is for the environmental kind of externalities that we're trying to solve for, and the primary one being climate change.
Totally. And I think there's so much confusion around that narrative. One of the big goals of the UK government, they're hosting COP26 this year, is to really bring the oceans narrative and the climate narrative together, because they totally overlap. It's interesting, like when we start to talk about the circular economy and you start to talk about, what the circular economy, ideally is a solve for the ocean plastic issue, right? It's the idea of just keeping everything in a closed loop so that it doesn't end up in the environment. But the amount of education that's needed, and I think that's where we come in at the OPLN. Certainly, that's the thought leadership work that you guys do at Closed Loop. This is a confusing mess. It's so complex. Like, where do we even begin? Like, if you had, you have a fifth grader, right?
I have a 7th grader.
Don't tell him I said that. Well, if you were to sit down in front of his class, and how would you describe, like in the simplest terms, the plastics challenge today?
Yeah, I would say that we have a lot of, in fact, it's really relevant because my son is learning about the carbon cycle right now. So he literally had to explain to me the carbon cycle and how that, is related to different greenhouse gases. And so as we were talking about that, they, in the 7th grade level, they're learning about fossil fuels, which is interesting. So those fossil fuels are being turned into something that has a great utility. And there's a lot of value in that. It takes him, one of his priorities in life is having money to spend on his gaming. So the idea of like accruing value and being able to kind of use that on something to be able to trade that value for something else, I think is a really important concept for kids. And so I think what we're doing right now is we're just throwing money in the garbage and we're throwing resources in the garbage. And that's a huge inefficiency that also is making our oceans and frankly our land more kind of less useful to our recreation, to animals that these kids all love. So there's kind of very tangible outputs that, like, you go to the beach, it's not what you want it to look like. You can't have as much fun there. And so that's what we need to solve for. And so we just need to have more efficiency when we're creating products and packaging. And it's all about, like, we often talk about the waste challenge, but I think really it's about the production side that we need to start thinking about from the get-go. How do we reduce extraction of non-renewable materials? And so what's the replacement for that? And that's, I think a lot of recycled content. I think it's some biomaterials. And to your point around like these narratives being confusing, humans are storytellers. We accept stories. We're not great at translating data and understanding that. So we do have to get our stories right. And I think climate change, frankly, has been even a harder one. I think the reason why this has gotten so much resonance is because there is something very tangible about the ocean, about these animals, and kind of the products that are in our hands.
Bridget and I were in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on the Ocean Plastic Leadership Summit a few years ago, snorkeling 500 miles off the coast of Bermuda. And one of the big CPGs that was with us, the consumer packaged goods companies, found one of its toothbrushes floating in the middle of the Atlantic Gyre. And like, she took it back home and showed everybody. Like, it's resonant. That's where plastics is different than climate. You can talk about the big storm or a wildfire, but the correlation is not so just crystal clear, right?
It's so direct. It's such a direct connection. And I think that can actually help open up the storytelling around climate and make it simpler. So not everything has to be brought up to kind of a big meta level like that. Like, we can help solve for climate change without ever talking about climate change, So, and I think the if you take out energy and transport, material movement and material, like all the materials that we use and consume in our lives, like that's one of the next major kind of categories of impact. And so, and it's an area that we have a lot of energy around and we can solve to. So you asked like what we're doing these days about 10, 12 minutes ago, which I didn't totally answer. But so maybe I'll just kind of say that our approach to solving for this is investing at every point of the product and packaging supply chain, from material science to how products and packaging are used, looking at kind of interesting reusable models that design the system so that it's easier and cheaper and more convenient for consumers to extend the shelf life of products, to reuse. That's both with kind of everyday products, personal care products, cleaning products, also with textiles. Resale is the fastest growing part of the textile and fashion industry right now. So like huge opportunity to gain more value from all of, by extending shelf life and reusing things. And then looking at, okay, what happens once the useful life is done? And can we really extract the value of that by making that the feedstock for future products and packaging?
I think fashion and fast fashion specifically has gotten such a free pass in this entire sort of plastics debate, and ocean plastics and microfibers. And again, it's the same sort of thing. You can see the bottle floating down the river, right? So obviously there's a tremendous amount of pressure that's being put on the big beverage companies. You can't see the microfibers that are in that same river that are coming off of our clothing. And it's real. I think that's another thing. I don't know if there's been any sort of widespread polling around, asking people, consumers, yes or no, is what you're wearing made of plastic? Like, I just don't think there's this like widespread.
No, I think it's something that I think it's coming. I think the reckoning is coming in that industry. And frankly, like the fashion industry has had a challenging year or two with COVID, but it's also driven some innovation. And I think some of the brands that are seeing the fastest growth are brands that are kind of integrating kind of different business models. And so we're seeing a ton of innovation in that space. We're not quite seeing the big brands come to the table yet on the solutions. And I think the pressure's just not been there. And so, eager to see that industry get to the point where consumer, CPG companies and kind of more broad scale retail is in terms of for license to operate, they need to solve some of these challenges. And I think probably the fashion industry is next in line. I hope electronics is close behind that. So I think an important concept is that this is about all materials. Plastics has gotten a lot of attention, but there's a lot of industries that fit into this, anything that is a material kind of fits within the circular or non-circular economy. So this is the built environment, it's textiles, it's electronics, it's supply chain logistics, it's food and organics, and it's plastics and packaging.
If you look at, you just talked about electronics too, you like see some of these places where all of our old phones and keyboards and computers are shipped in Ghana or India or China. And it's jarring, especially when you see in some of these places, you see kids burning the electronics to get the valuable metals out, burning the plastic off to get the metals from inside. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, no, it is crazy. And I do think like what's happened in the last few years related to plastics and the oceans shows that when you can win hearts of consumers around this stuff, and that impacts regulators, that impacts brands, like that they impact everything. So when it comes down to like what people can do, and certainly what the media can do, is like telling these stories creates the mind share in a kind of a world where we have massive attention deficits, related to these. It's all like an attention-based economy right now. So if we can drive attention towards these issues and it resonates with people, then regulation happens, brands change their products and packaging because they are beholden to the consumers that are buying their products. And so that is really powerful. It feels daunting, but we've proven, I think, in this space that we can really show that society wants the space to move in a significant way.
I think one of the other things that's at a macro global level that's happening, certainly you have consumer pressure, which is so far, I think, been like one of the biggest drivers of essentially corporations, rewriting their playbooks about how they deal with this. Where I think we're going to get to the next level, and what we're seeing at an international legal level, is like ecocide laws, where companies can be held responsible in like international courts of law in the same way that they like international war crimes would be tried. Like that's coming. That's not quite here yet. First rights of nature, where a river on behalf, like an indigenous group on behalf of a river, can sue a corporation, right? I mean, it becomes like existential risk management in an entirely different type of way, which I mean, if like on a hopeful sort of matrix, on an optimistic, I'm wearing my optimistic t-shirt, which these letters are there's probably plastic in there, like everybody.
You look very, very believable.
Okay. But I mean, that is the next lever, and risk management is a key driver, especially when you get to like the CFO's seat, right? Like
definitely. And I'd say another industry that's quite behind is the industry that we're in, which is the finance industry, which certainly makes the world go round in terms of consumer products and such. And so the big banks and big finance is starting to pay attention to these issues. But, our goal of coming into fruition 7 years ago as an investor is to prove the business models around circular economy. So there's a reason we're not a nonprofit. We're a for-profit because we want to be taken, we wanted this industry to be taken seriously as a business opportunity. And I think that when we started, we had some corporate investors that were really focused on kind of pulling capital to solve for infrastructure challenges that were outside of what they can control on their own. In the last 7 years, I'd say we have a significant number of investors, well more than we have corporate, on the kind of institutional family office side. But that whole space of banks is still early on. And what's really interesting is recently, to your point, to all your points about these big things that are happening globally, the SEC in the US has just kind of come down really hard around the rules of impact investing and what impact actually looks like. And so making sure that you can't just say like, I'm a circular economy fund and we just like fund big businesses that may do like a little bit of circular economy stuff kind of, or have some goal that they may or may not ever achieve. And so I expect it to get the rules and the regulators, to be coming out of a lot of different angles, not just through EPR, but through all these other tools that you and I are talking about.
Just thinking all this through and like going back to seventh graders, and how we get seventh graders smarter, which is mission critical, and what seventh graders are learning today. I tell you, I wasn't learning about carbon cycles in seventh grade, and I'm guessing you weren't either.
No,
it's significant, but part of the challenge is we don't have time for the seventh graders to grow up and take the wheel here. So who and how do we educate the people that are driving right now? Certainly leaders, different industries, and thinking about leverage. I think you just nailed it. Who has all the leverage? The financial community, right? If you are going to get a CEO of a Fortune 500 to snap to attention, it's the banks that are government, or the banks, right? And the government can get a little tricky when you start talking about policy, because you're coming in from all different angles, right?
Yeah, and I think that, we need short-term and we need long-term solutions. First of all, I think just speaking of children and seventh graders, I was talking with folks in my company, and we were kind of thinking about like, how do you make sure we're holding the leaders in companies and banks and others accountable to achieving their goals? And a lot of them have like 2030, 2050 goals. And we're like, the person who's going to be held accountable right now is a seventh grader to achieving those goals. Like literally my son will be the age, of a CEO when those goals have to be hit. And so we're basically asking today's seventh graders to be accountable. And so we need to create much accountability along the way towards these, we need the long-term goals, and we need proxies and indicators that we're actually achieving those goals. And I think, many companies started with 2025 goals. 2025 is tomorrow. I know that's coming really soon. And everyone's kind of like pushing back to 2030. And so I do think that these influencers, and it's all about sphere of influence for any kind of important decision maker, but and there's many of them. The big banks are a very big one, but certainly not the only one. But we need to kind of have the pressure to achieve these goals sooner. Like shareholders would never be comfortable saying, "Don't worry, we'll make a profit in 2050." We need this to happen much sooner. Like, show us how we're getting there.
So, yeah, dead on the money. It's interesting to think about the seventh graders eventually captaining the ship based on these goals. That's really kind of fascinating and mind-blowing. I have a 5-year-old, so like, yeah,
it's a lack of accountability today to say, like, you know, somebody's maybe grandchild will have to be accountable to these goals.
They weren't thinking about that in 1950. I don't
Exactly.
think, when they didn't have any idea what was
Yeah, we can't predict what's coming down the pike. Exactly. So
what are you working on at Closed Loop Partners that these financial institutions, captains of industry, what do you feel like the key pieces of work that you guys are doing that can help accelerate, you know, the environmental intelligence of leaders today?
Yeah. So a couple things. We're investing through kind of early stage capital. We're closing our second venture fund. Our first venture fund was around 15 million. This one's going to be closer to, you know, somewhere 50 plus. So more than triple the size of our first one. So great to see kind of the growth in capital coming into innovation in the circular economy. But I think the innovation space is super hot, and these companies setting the market signals such that there's that the innovation is coming into this space. Like, we want all of these big kind of mega trend innovations, whether it's AI, blockchain, material science, we need it to be directed towards the circular economy. And frankly, I think that given that the circular economy is about entirely, you know, all of these materials across multiple sectors and supply chains, it's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. So it could be the biggest investment opportunity of our lifetime. And so that's one thing. Then thinking about, okay, what infrastructure is in place to manage this? So we're not only investing in the infrastructure of today and making it better, but we're saying, how do we actually need to change the supply chain, and what needs to be connected? What dots need to be connected, whether it's some vertical integration or kind of multiple material solutions in a municipality, you know, covering all of the materials that are a cost to a city to throw away, but could be of value. Right now, you know, we really focus on packaging, but can we include electronics, textiles, organics? The economics should work long-term given the amount of value in that material. So investing in kind of creating comprehensive solutions for municipalities and infrastructure around that. And then I guess the third thing is—
Can I stop you? We'll come back to third.
Of course.
So it's examples of infrastructure. So material recycling facilities. I know you guys have made some strategic investment there. Anything else? Any other?
Yeah. So we have invested in a company called Atlas Organics, which is one of the fastest growing composting companies in the southern United States, and that weirdly came through our venture fund, which you wouldn't think of. It feels more like an infrastructure play, but actually their business model and how they grow and how they have contracts and how they finance their facilities gave us the confidence and a kind of a venture approach to their growth. So the fact that they're planning to grow that fast is huge. I would also say on the organic side, we invested in a company called Home Biogas, which is residential scale household anaerobic digestion that turns food waste into energy. And in many countries where folks are both kind of mostly food is the majority of their waste and they're energy deficient, it's a solution on both sides, and it's like super affordable. But the company's also kind of eyeing Western markets, and actually their e-commerce, the US is their fastest growing e-commerce business, but they're looking at kind of long-term, like what would the experience be like for someone in the US to potentially just put their food waste down their garbage disposal, have that plug right into a home biogas unit that's in your boiler room, and then kind of let that heat your water in your household.
And they're just like little, they look like little composting machines?
Yeah, they're like little, they're kind of they look like a balloon that's like the size of a couple grills maybe right now, but they're going to continue to kind of shrink in size to fit into different kind of inside units, so they can also be kind of more used in the north. But so I think that brings up a trend that I would say around kind of less centralization of everything, like the idea of sending around big expensive trucks to pick up food waste, when that can be happening in a much more decentralized way. Like in some markets that still might make sense today, but long term, we believe there's that both manufacturing and management of materials will be much more distributed and much less centralized, which goes along with a lot of other trends in the world towards decentralization. So which is really exciting, because then you can start to localize manufacturing, which means that you can utilize materials that go through a recycling facility, which is a local thing. Like you don't want to re-aggregate that and send that across the country. But if you can kind of collect those materials and then remanufacture that at a local level, and then kind of distribute that regionally, like we believe that there is going to be a significant increase in that kind of localization.
That's super cool, and obviously that's going to help with the carbon trade-off, right? I mean, because
it
you're not
sure
going to
is.
have many trucks driving around.
It sure is. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think these two are really tied together, and I don't think we're the only ones thinking about this. Like if you talk to a lot of kind of tech investors or big retailers, we're hearing this kind of trend from lots of folks, and I think it's really relevant given some of the supply chain risks that folks faced in the early parts of the COVID lockdowns. And so that, much like everything else, COVID has accelerated some of these trends.
That's so cool. I cut you off. Remember, you were going to number 3. Do you remember?
Oh yeah. So the third one. So through our Center for Circular Economy, which is really our innovation arm, we bring industry together to solve kind of more particular challenges. And I think the big thing that we're seeing is just competitors who may be fierce competitors on the consumer side and I think you're experiencing this too in your work, are coming together because they know that they can't solve these issues by themselves. And so we're working, through our Next Gen program to solve for food packaging and cups with Starbucks and McDonald's and Yum Brands and Nestle and others. And then we brought together many retailers to solve kind of for their big exposure issue, their big challenge that they have ownership of is their single-use bags. And so we brought together Walmart, Target, CVS, who kind of accelerated maybe 10 to 12 other retailers joining, where we're doing kind of an end-to-end, looking for innovation to kind of solve for these challenging specific problems within an industry, helping work within their supply chains to scale up these solutions so that they can get to a commercial level that these companies need in order to use them. Because oftentimes there's like, cool, innovation, we're going to give them, $1,000 and then like leave them be. And these guys really need some hand holding to understand how to get through these corporate supply chains and actually work with the big guys, and then making sure that the recovery system will accept anything on the other end. And what's interesting with retail is like, when you look at kind of the plastic bag as one very specific example, it's the argument, the silly argument that I would say is like paper versus plastic. Like the reality is there's no one-for-one solution. There's trade-offs for everything. So we need to think about like, what is the future of retail and how can we solve for that? So if a big part of that is home delivery and e-commerce, if we're looking at last mile providers who are kind of home delivering things, you could easily have kind of reusable totes and then have a reverse logistics program that takes all that back. So really exciting solutions if we're looking at kind of where, how consumption is going to exist 3 to 5 years from now, kind of. So, and recycling has historically been kind of like lagging behind the packaging industry. And so what we want to do, kind of reinvent kind of within the circular economy framing, is how can we get ahead of trends as opposed to like following on to where all the product and packaging folks are going.
Reusable and reuse and refill is like the holy grail, right? I mean, and you're not going to, there's all these like landmine solutions that, where that you can, there's fierce, ferocious battles happening everywhere, whether it be policy or whether it be like advanced recycling and some of these, recycling technologies, but like, you're not going to find much argument around reuse or refill.
Yeah.
It's just about how we can accelerate a complete sort of change the way people live. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard enough to get people to like take their stuff to the recycle it curbside, right? Let alone take it to a recycling center. Like I mean, and by the way, a little plug for the reusies. Did you
I was just going to do that. Yeah, it's on the September 30th at 7 p.m. the East Coast time. If you go to thereusies.com, you can get tickets for the first reuse award show, where we're going to see kind of best in class solutions in the space, because not all solutions are created equal. And there are some really amazing ones, some really well capitalized ones that we think are going to scale quite a bit. And so I definitely, it's super affordable and going to be really fun, and lots of good conversation and some interesting guests. So come to that. Anyway, continue. I'm done.
The reusies. Reusables are, I mean, it's interesting. And for those that aren't familiar, it's just this idea of having a Haagen-Dazs ice cream in a metal container that you buy once and then either send or return so that it can be filled with more ice cream, right? As opposed to just having this like that in its sense is like how it works. One of the examples of how it works on the sort of consumer packaged goods side of things. Closed Loop's an investor in Algramo. I'll let you talk about what they do. They're badass.
Yeah. So Algramo is so cool. We love them. They are it's essentially like a packaging vending service with smart reusable packaging, where you actually pay with your packaging. It's like smart IoT packaging that's tied to your phone and essentially a wallet. So you go in, to this vending machine, with your packaging, you say how much you want. So like if you can only afford to buy a little bit, in areas that may have, if you have cash flow challenges, you can buy as little or much as you want. You can fill a large container up, or you can just fill it up a little bit and get kind of a day's worth of that product. They're working primarily with cleaning products and personal care products and pet food today, but certainly aim to expand. And the reality is packaging is a cost center. It's for big companies. So if they don't have to pay for single-use packaging as part of the product, they want to sell you product, not packaging. So if you are using the same packaging, it should be more cost effective. And that's the Algramo kind of model, is like you bring your own packaging, you refill it, and you save somewhere between 20 to 40% on the products that you're buying. So it's a real consumer benefit. And so they've really taken off, where they launched in Chile, and we're an investor, and we brought in some other investors from Mexico and elsewhere now that are helping them expand into these different markets. They're in New York City with us. There's going to be a big announcement this fall with a major retailer in the US. So stand by on that excitement, also in Mexico and moving into Europe and Asia. But it's just one example of a best-in-class solution that's creating a better, more convenient, more affordable experience for the consumer. And so I think what we need to remember with all of these things is that, think about the consumer. Marketers are thinking about the consumer all the time. And so how can we design the system where these new models work for the consumer? Because you can't just get pissed off at a bad system. You have to come up with a better one, or the incumbent system's always going to stay in place. And so, the reuses is important because we need to find the best in class ones. And some aren't tenable for consumers today. And so that creates the market signal that there's really good kind of best in class solutions out today. And that drives other innovators and companies to the table, both to test these and to come up with even better solutions, and more investors to come into this space. And so this change can happen. And we hear sometimes from big consumer product companies, some are really excited about it and they're going all in on reuse as like where they want to get to in 2030. Others are very bearish or sheepish on this space, feeling like it's a long way to go. But if you look at the world we lived in 30 years ago, all of our behaviors were different. It's a completely different universe. So to think that we can't get there, I think, is naive. And we just need to come up with the mix of solutions that create a better experience.
It's interesting you mentioned marketing, because on some level, certainly, like, I think when we talk about the CFO seat or the financial sector, like, risk management is a core driver. But when we get into the consumer side of things, marketing's everything. And cool factor to some degree, and certainly social pressure and different along sort of different socioeconomic status levels, and all over, obviously things are very different all over the earth as well. But, that's why I applaud what you guys in Upstream are doing with the reuses, because it's just showing people cool shit.
Exactly.
And how can we get more people excited? How can we get reuse and refill on the front page of the New York Times,
That's exactly right. It's showing people cool shit and letting them have a good time. Like, this stuff needs to be fun and interesting and sexy for the consumer. It needs to be the thing that's super obvious to them. They need to want the new system in order to exit the old system. It's the only way. And we need marketers to, be smart when they're thinking about this side. It's a huge opportunity for marketers that are on the front end of this. Like, once everybody's doing it, then you're just kind of another one doing it. But for the companies that are leaders today are not going to be the companies that are leaders 20 years from now, unless they're really kind of forward thinking. And I mean, we've seen this, like, if you look back 20 or 30 years at the biggest companies in the world 30 years from now, some of them don't even exist. Some of them have been broken up, and many of them don't exist or aren't on that list anymore. The ones that are the ones that have rebuilt themselves into a different kind of company, different markets. Many of the consumer product companies are buying up these kind of smaller, kind of eco-friendly, natural, however we want to define that brand category, because that space is fragmenting too, and they know that they need to keep on the cutting edge of that. And it's the same thing on how consumers buy. And so the marketers thinking about that and getting out front of it and being leaders, like, they're the ones that are going to be, out front 20 and 30 years from now.
Well, and let's talk about reuse and refill, because I think there's the two leading global models right now are Loop, which run by TerraCycle, Tom Zaki and co, and Algramo, which is really designed for two very, very different markets, right? Like the Loop, like that's where I got the Haagen-Dazs example, right? Like, of really beautiful, beautiful packaging. And I mean, they have all kinds of different packagings for all kinds of different product levels. But it's designed at, I would say, a more sort of higher, like, middle class and up. Would you describe social?
Kind of urban audience. Yes,
environmentally conscious audience. For the do-gooder sort of audience, it's definitely more work than just throwing your stuff away, or even to some degree putting it in your recycling bin. But then you have Algramo, which is designed, really more efficiently for lower, like the pilots you have in New York are like in Queens and different sort of lower economic status, right? Like,
that's right. That's the primary incoming market. Exactly.
Right. It's like people, you can buy a single use shot of laundry detergent, as a part of one of these Algramo machines, and it's going to save you money significantly. And there's no packaging, and it's like a win-win.
And that's what we found is the entry point for consumers, is that, like, oh, this reuse thing, like, that's kind of interesting. Some people are already, like, dishing out small amounts of laundry detergent and putting them in, like, old plastic bottles and stuff like that to make it more convenient to bring them to their laundromat in urban areas. So we're seeing some trends that we can jump on, that Algramo can jump on. But the cost-effective piece is kind of the entry point, and then they get interested in everything else. And other people are going to have different entry points. So, like, with the Loop model, I think it's very much the identity entry point of, like, I identify as someone who does this kind of thing, and I'm going to show my friends this, and this, I have beautiful kind of fancy packaging that's out on my, sitting out. But I think there's a couple of other models that are starting too, is that some of the big companies are just doing it themselves, especially with some refills that can go into, it's not no packaging in terms of single use, but creating a much kind of like a refill version that you can refill, kind of a nicer package that sits out at home. An example of that, both Unilever and Procter & Gamble have launched refillable deodorant canisters this year. I've tried them both. They're pretty interesting. And there were some kind of smaller challenger brands that kicked that off before these guys did that themselves. And so they're creating that. I also think things like no packaging and reformulating products so that it can go into packaging that doesn't have to be as complex and unrecyclable. We're seeing trends towards that too. So Grove Collaborative, I think, is a really interesting, fast-growing company, sells multiple products, but also their own. So they're doing bar shampoos and soaps and stuff, but they're also doing a lot of kind of refill stuff that they have full ownership of, because they're an e-com kind of company primarily today. And we're seeing some of the bigger companies. I think Procter & Gamble's, started to go down this path. Unilever, I already mentioned those two, but they're both putting stuff out in the market. And I think we'll see more and more companies going to market themselves and using that. And then the one last example I want to give, just to be long-winded, is in the food QSR kind of food packaging space. I think reusable cups, reusable foodware is a fast-growing category and something that I think consumers are starting to really resonate with, partially because it's like a better experience to have like a nice dish and a nice cup to drink your coffee out of. But there's companies like, some pretty interesting companies, Our Cup, Turn, many others. Like we've worked with several. There you can like look on them on the Reusey site actually and see what many of them are that create systems that make it easy for the consumer to get their coffee cup, whether it's or beverage cup at an event and or at a retailer, and drop it off, and it gets sanitized and brought back into the system for you, so you don't have to remember your own cup. And same with bags. We're working with Walmart and Target and CVS on a Beyond the Bag, which is a program to find innovation to reduce the need for single-use bags, both at brick and mortar, but also with home delivery and others. And there's some really great solutions out there.
There's a lot of exciting things going on. And I mean, it's interesting, like this carrot and stick, right? It's got to be shiny and sexy and efficient. And there's got to be sort of social pressure dynamics on the consumer side and the stick side. Like, you need to fix this because it's an existential risk management crisis and it's going to negatively affect your business if you don't. And it's better to be, just like you said, it's better to be out in front of it. We could keep going, Bridget. This is
we could. Our rambling discourse.
Your work is always extremely exciting, and so grateful to partner with you on so many exciting things.
I'm happy to be here anytime, and can't wait to keep working together.
So much coming up in this next coming year, but everyone, just want to say thank you. Bridget Croke, Managing Director, Closed Loop Partners. And I want to say thank you for checking in for the Environmental Intelligence Podcast. And we're rocking every 2 weeks here and just digging into how to get everyone smarter rapidly about the environment. Thanks so much.